the Triathlon Show 352. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of that Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Mikael, and on today's episode I have a bit of a different episode for you. I was recently invited to the Oxidative Potential podcast as a guest, and I had a very nice chat with Matthew DesRoches, who is one of the hosts of the podcast. And Matthew kindly agreed that I could republish the interview here on that Triathlon Show. So that's what we have in store for today. You should definitely go and check out the Oxidative Potential podcast. I'll put all the links in the show notes and episode description. It's got a fantastic list of topics and guests, many of whom will be familiar to you from previous episodes here on that Triathlon Show as well. But in this conversation, we discuss a wide variety of topics with Matthew and myself, spanning training and coaching, exercise physiology, and technology. So hopefully there is something for everyone in there. But before we get into that, a big thanks to our sponsors. First, we have Roka. Roka produce exceptional quality triathlon wetsuits, tri-suits, swim skins, goggles, performance sunglasses, and prescription eyeglasses and sunglasses. If you want to go faster in the water or on the bike, a Roka wetsuit or tri-suit might be for you. Or if you just want to have a more comfortable, functional and stylish pair of eyeglasses, then look to their range of eyewear. Today, I want to revisit Roka's tri-suit, the Gen 2 Elite Aero model. This is a suit developed and perfected based on both wind tunnel and real-world testing on the road and in the water, importantly. It is designed to provide the optimal balance of aerodynamics, function and comfort from sprint to full iron distance triathlons. And just like the Roka wetsuits, it comes with arms up technology for maximal mobility when swimming. And I can tell you from trying a large number of wetsuits or tri-suits, you will really feel it. It won't constrain you, your swimming even a little bit. That's what it feels like, how good it feels to be swimming in this tri-suit. Whereas a lot of other tri-suits, especially the ones that are focused a lot on aerodynamics, will constrain your shoulder mobility a bit. Visit roka.com/TTS to get 20% off your entire order. And thank you to Zen8. The Zen8 indoor swim trainer is a one-of-a-kind swim bench that helps you improve your technique through an early catch, maximize propulsion through a more powerful stroke, and stay consistent by doing swim workouts at home, even when you can't go to the pool. It is available in the UK, EU, and US with free shipping in both the UK and the US. It is very affordable, similar to a pair of running shoes, and best of all, the investment is risk-free. If you're not in love with the Zen8 trainer after 2 weeks using it and using their free program, you can send it back and get a full refund. Learn more and get a 20% discount on your swim trainer on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, here's myself and Matthew DesRoches from the Oxidative Potential podcast.
You know, I actually really like doing podcasts with people that have had their own podcast or have their own podcast, because you get a feel for the individual of, you know, what are some things that you're really interested to hear them in. Like sometimes when you hear of someone or you maybe read an article, it's hard to try and extract what you actually want to understand from what that person has to offer. But like a person like yourself and others, like I've listened to hundreds of hours, right? So you get an idea of some of the areas that this person kind of maybe diverges from a path or maybe resides on a certain path that you're interested in. So that's why I'm excited to talk to you today, because you know, you have a great podcast, honestly, like especially the fact that you have the mixture of coaching and researchers, which I'm trying to do, but it's hard. So very happy to have you on today.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's true. It is hard. I also find that to be the case, especially, and I'm curious to hear what you think, but for me, the hard part is often finding, you know, really good quality coaches, because there's always somebody else starting a new PhD. So there's always going to be researchers, but I find that getting really good coaches to interview, that's the more difficult part.
Actually, you're actually right on the money with that, because lately I've been like, you know, sifting through books and sifting through articles. I'm like trying to find coaches in the field that are like really kind of on the edge where I'm interested in. They have a decent understanding of physiology, a really good coaching prowess, and also have, interest in some of the things that they like to talk about. But one of the things I've noticed over the years is a lot of coaches, they kind of dig in, and I can understand this being the case, time constraints, things of this nature, where they just they create their system, and that system stays until the day they die, right? Like that's the system. The system is a system, whether it's a university coach, whether it's and they get really good at maybe some of the actual coaching practice itself of coaching an individual. But on the physiology side, and there's arguments to be made on both sides of why those have pros and cons. But it's funny that you say that. Let's actually start with a little bit of an introduction, because I mean, people that have come from your podcast probably might not even have heard your introduction into coaching, and how did you get to the point where you're at now? So maybe start with, because I know your background is engineering, but how did this kind of wind up as what you wanted to hone in on?
Yeah, I guess I got into endurance sports. I did my first marathon when I was 17, but my main sport was football growing up, European football, so soccer. And but then as I started university, I stopped playing football, and I just started running, I guess, recreationally, having already done that one marathon. And then it turned into something that I would do. I would sign up for a marathon, I would train for a few months, and then I would take a break, and then I would do the same cycle again. And usually I would get a bit faster every time. Definitely wasn't a speedster starting out, but I got to the point where I got more and more into the pursuit of getting faster, and started reading a lot. I think Jack Daniels or Pete Fitzinger were the two first running books and endurance sports books really that I devoured, and then I just branched out from there and got really into the whole running thing, and started with a little bit of coaching there as well, just a few friends and family and that kind of thing. And then I got injured for my own running, and started taking up cycling and swimming as cross training. I had always had in the back of my mind that at some point in my life I would start doing triathlon, and then that was a natural thing to do as cross training for now, and do a couple of triathlons without really training to run at all, because I really couldn't. I was in a lot of pain when I was running, so I did that. And then when I eventually was able to run again without any issues, which took quite a while, I was really hooked on the whole triathlon thing. Training for 3 different sports was just so fun, and it opened up a whole new world of challenges, and which I found a good thing about the sport, like more things to think about and challenges to overcome. So I guess I then just kept learning about endurance sports the way I had been doing in running, but in the triathlon space, and from there it didn't take me too long in triathlon until I started coaching, but again very small scale at first, and just people that weren't very at that point very fast or professional or anything, just regular age groupers, and just a handful of them basically. And I did that alongside. I was graduating university at the time that I got that injury, or I had just graduated and was working in engineering, in medical engineering. And that's where I started coaching alongside that, just as a bit of a side gig. But then eventually I decided that I really, really liked it. I was really passionate about it, and I wanted to get better at coaching, and I wanted to focus on it, and I wanted to do it full time if I could. But I realized that the only way that I could give myself the chance of doing that was to quit my normal job, so take a bit of a leap of faith, and so that's what I did. And that was in 2017, so 5 years ago now that I started coaching full time, and at that same time is when I started the podcast at Triathlon Show as well.
That's interesting, and it's funny, like sometimes the way I think of coaching is, when you start coaching, obviously it's never optimal. Like you're not necessarily prepared for the task at hand, but it almost works the best, because when you're working with athletes that have a large potential to grow, it's hard to screw things up, right? Whereas you get better and better as a coach, you start to coach more elite athletes, and it's obviously much easier to screw up an elite athlete than it is to make them better.
I would say that you can still screw things up really well with non-elites, but it's much easier to find the gains. It's
exactly
completely different. Yeah.
Yes. No, you're exactly right on that. Like, there's definitely some situations with overreaching, overtraining, and also not understanding proper load and understanding stress and different things surrounding that can be weak points for sure. It's interesting that you started with running. Now, when you got into triathlon, like as a whole, what were some of the things that you noticed in the scene? Like, did you notice there was, because when we go into the individual sports themselves, whether it's running, cycling, like I look at cycling as kind of where people hold physiology to a much higher degree of importance. They hold metrics to a much higher degree of importance. What were some of the things compared to running? What were some of the things that you noticed in triathlon that was kind of different in the culture itself? Because it might seem like it's the same culture as everything, but it inherently, from what I've noticed, is a little bit different than some of these other sports.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that assessment when you compare cycling and running, and say that the exact same thing applies to triathletes generally, like a large focus on metrics and data, and so that's the main thing that I would say. What else? It's hard to say because it also varies a lot from country to country. Like in Finland, it would be quite different to Portugal, for example. So Portugal is where I live now, and Finland is where I lived when I was still working as an engineer. I think in Finland you have a very dominant triathlon scene that is very dominated by age groupers. A lot of them 30 years and over, whereas in Portugal you have much more of you have a lot of youth doing triathlon. You have people starting doing triathlon when they're 7 or 8 years old, and you don't see that in Finland. So it by definition, I think, gives a completely different spin on the whole culture thing, because people have grown up with triathlon when they didn't have any clue what a watt is or what pace is. They were just out riding their bikes and running and swimming. So I think maybe there's a bit, which I think can be a good thing, because I think sometimes there is too much of an emphasis on the metrics and the data among age groupers in particular, I would say. So, but are there other things that are different? Well, I think triathletes have a lot of things going for them as well. Like, they are very meticulous. They are good at preparing things. They really take their sport seriously, and I think that's a good thing if your goal is performance. So they're always looking for ways to get faster, and sometimes that backfires. But I think that the sentiment is correct, and people are willing to experiment. I think, as long as you channel this culture and the typical triathlete mindset correctly, I think it's a good one. But sometimes it backfires, but you just have to channel it correctly, I would say.
That does make a lot of sense. Like, inherently, when you think of the demands of triathlon, your training has to be much more organized, even if you want to participate at a lower level, compared to something like just running or cycling. You just hop on the bike and go. Doesn't really matter. But when you are training for a triathlon, there is, there's different considerations about how you're stacking workouts and just having things ready in place and organized, so you can, whether it's meet the timing for the open pool workout or whatever at the Masters swim group, meeting everything is just kind of more under a condensed time frame. So it inherently requires more focus and detail than maybe just grabbing your shoes and hopping on for a run. So I have some questions here that I sent over, and I'm excited to get into them, because the first one in particular was surrounding power duration modeling. Because I think everyone, whenever we're talking about not necessarily running as much, but with cycling in particular and triathlon, power duration modeling of some sort is kind of somewhere in the scheme for people. So some of the people that you've had on the podcast before, like Bjorn Kafka and Sebastian Weber, so they offer some of these products for athletes to go and try and understand. Hey, there's more to just power duration modeling than critical power. What do you see the big use for these types of analytical softwares? Do you see them as replacements for physiology testing? Do you think they're just more practical, more feasible? Do you think that they can be used on a regular basis to kind of help understand changes and responses to training? What's your whole kind of idea surrounding these things? Do you use them anymore? Do you use just basic critical power? What are some of the things that you think of this?
So maybe just a little bit of an intro for listeners that are not familiar. So this concept, the model, if you will, comes from the 80s in Germany by Alois Mader was the one who developed it primarily, and it constitutes how VO2 max, your maximum aerobic capacity, and VLA max, your maximum glycolytic capacity, basically act as control switches, or not switches, but knobs that then their interaction determines things like your maximum lactate steady state, and that is of course something that we have known for a long time is critical for endurance performance. So basically, the idea is that you can, if you know things like your VO2 max and your VLA max, you can then figure out exactly what is your MLSS, and also things like fat oxidation at certain intensities and so on. You can basically simulate your whole physiology based on a couple of capacity parameters. I have used both Insight and AirTune in the past, and I'm not doing it anymore. I stopped somewhere around last year in the spring, I believe, for various reasons. There's actually some very new. Well, actually, it's not peer reviewed yet. It's a preprint, but Simon Nolte just recently published something on that where they looked at all of the studies that have been done so far, trying to validate the model with actual athletes, and what he basically concluded is that for running, the model clearly does not seem to work in its current state, and for cycling, it's a little bit less damning, but it's not necessarily recommended either. It's not clear that it's definitely working either. So there are some. I think that some of the issues that they point out include things like, well, when you're measuring your VLA max, for example, you're measuring capillary lactate concentration, but the model talks about the lactate concentration in the muscle, not in the bloodstream. So the measurements are not exactly the ones that you would need to do to actually be able to use the model. And then in addition to that, there are some certain assumptions, including some parameters that have not necessarily been validated to be the same for everybody. There might be individual variations there and so on. So long story short, I did use them. But to be honest, the main reason that I stopped using it was that the athletes that I did that sort of testing with and that sort of analysis with versus the athletes that I didn't do it with, in the end, once I got enough of a sample size, I didn't find that it helped me coach them better or helped me get better results. So then I stopped. Like, I don't want to do anything if it doesn't bring additional value. And it took me some time to realize that, but that's what I found when I analyzed the results. But I do use critical power and power duration modeling, as you said. So that's something that I use a lot, and I think that has value. But it's also very simple to do. You can do it without going into a lab. Well, actually, with the softwares you mentioned, you can do it without going into a lab as well. So that's a strength of theirs. But still, critical power compared to going into a laboratory is very good, that you don't pay anything for it, and you don't pay time either to travel to a laboratory or at least maybe take a few hours off of your day to go and do that. So I do use that. Was there another part of the question that I missed?
No, that hits on everything on where you stand with that, which was interesting hearing, because I inherently really like the way that you think, because does this help me do my job better or not? And I think sometimes, even with physiological testing, it's really, it can make things easier, but it can also make things harder in some ways. And you have to be honest, especially with certain athletes, when it's appropriate to use certain things. That's what I've noticed over the years. Is does if someone's just getting into the sport or has been in the sport for 2 years, should we really be honing in on some of the things that we're honing in on? Yes, maybe not. But realistically, if it helps you do your job better, then by all means. But the hard part is that heuristic with many coaches is, because it's a model that they're using, the model that they're familiar with, they kind of gravitate and say, yes, the bias is there where it is helping me because it's metrics, it's pretty, it's this or it's that. But yeah, that is interesting, and I can totally understand that, because you're very data driven in your decision making. Essentially, like, obviously you're taking in the human factors as well, but you are kind of checking the boxes, and does this meet the requirements to help me do my job better? So I thought that was a really good answer.
Yeah.
Another thing I'm interested to hear, because this kind of springs off of this now, is how do you monitor response to training intervention? So when you're working with an athlete and you're prescribing specific type of, whether it's training blocks or a specific theme of training, whether it's conjugate periodized training, block periodization, how are you monitoring their response to that? Is there hard and fast rules that you use as red flags for everyone? Is it more of a case by case basis? Do you monitor HRV, like rolling HRV? Do you monitor? I'm sure you monitor the comments and RP and things like that. But what are your big kind of pillars for making decisions on training intervention and training response?
Yeah. So there's a lot of variables that go into it, but the most important ones are, well, first of all, not first of all necessarily, but I look at the objective performance data, of course, from workouts and tests. And very often in a training block, we have we're trying to work on maybe bridging some gaps in the athlete's performance. So maybe they need to be able to bike at a certain power in their next race, and we're trying to get that power up. We're doing some specific workouts, and we're seeing that they can hold a higher power, or they can extend their power for a longer duration. So it's very clear and objective that they are improving. So it doesn't have to be a formal test, but all that objective data from training is important. And depending on what the focus of a training block is, then obviously that influences what the specific data that I look at the most will be. But then alongside that, of course, conversations with the athletes and so about how they perceive that they are feeling, that they're improving in general, and they're feeling in the workouts, and that how they feel they're performing in the workouts. That's very critical, and the workout comments and RPE as well go in that category of subjective feedback. That's just as important. And in terms of red flags, for example, when to pull back, I think it's usually the comments, whether it's or the discussions face to face. Those are the two main ones where those red flags tend to come up. Sure, it could be like a workout that goes really badly, but unless the comment or the discussion after indicate that something is up, it could have just been a bad day, and we don't necessarily need to take any action on that. But if they feel, if they say something more in a more negative tone, so that, oh, I'm really struggling right now, work is really tough right now, and I just don't feel like I had any chance of hitting those numbers. That's the kind of comment that would probably generate some changes in the training for the next few days anyway. What else? Heart rate variability, HRV. I did use it quite a lot for some time. To be honest, right now I don't really use it. For example, I stopped measuring it personally, and I never required my athletes to to measure it, although I did encourage it and I did monitor it. Now, some of my athletes still do measure it, but I'm less interested in it right now, to be completely honest. There are many reasons for it, but I think that it's maybe a bit overhyped, being completely blunt, because it's measuring the state of the autonomic nervous system, the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic, the parasympathetic sympathetic balance. But there's so much more that could go wrong in the body if we're looking for red flags than that particular balance. So I find that not every red flag will pop up as HRV, and that's the kind of thing that I've seen a little bit, that some athletes or coaches get a little bit too secure in that if HRV is good, then everything is good. And that's something that I don't think is the case, and I see the opposite to be true. So that's the reason that I'm not really using it anymore. And the other reason, I guess, is that I've seen that, especially in very well-trained athletes, and most of the athletes that I work with these days are really, really well-trained. So then HRV is just extremely stable most of the time. Sure, if you get really sick, then you can see changes to it, but you don't really see any changes beyond the smallest worthwhile change in most training blocks necessarily. So it doesn't really help you one way or another, I don't think.
No, I think that's good. There's a couple things in there. One, I know you've had John Kiley on your podcast. I'm a huge fan of John's work, and what you noted was you pay attention on the athlete's perception of their training, not just the inherent response and what they felt, but their perception of how the training is going, how the training is. And I think that's a big thing because, for example, there's plenty of athletes that could definitely improve from some of the training interventions that are out there, but their perceptions of those training interventions will inherently decrease a lot of the positive adaptations that they could yield from that because of the stress of undertaking something that they do not believe in. It's the same as forcing someone to, exercise. The inherent response to that is going to be different than if they're engaging that for, certain intrinsic motivations. That just creates a completely different neurological environment, physiological environment, just because of the endocrine responses. And anyways, that was good. That I really enjoyed hearing you speak on that, because a lot of coaches will say RPE, but they don't really talk about how does the athlete perceive what they're doing. Do they perceive it as a waste of time? Do they perceive it as maybe not benefiting them? All those things really, really do matter. Another thing, I've been very deep into HRV at this point. There's just so much misconception around HRV, and there's so much nuance to accurately recording HRV. I think that a lot of it is lost, whether it's these scores that these algorithms and softwares are spitting out. That's a big problem. Also, the way in that they're measuring sporadically through the night on a time basis versus at specific stages of the sleep cycle, or if they're doing morning HRV measures, how consistent and what are they using? There's so many variables that go into play of how clean is that data, how accurate is that data? Because if we're looking at something very sensitive, the ability for those sensitive measures to be thrown off by various things. And yes, we are seeing, if you're looking at some of these longer trends, it kind of cleans out a lot of that noise. But inherently too, I think a lot of the way people use HRV, I don't know if it's necessarily the most optimal, because if you look at the research on how HRV is used in medicine versus how it's being prescribed in training, it's kind of like, I don't know if this is the most optimal way to be using it, especially go or no go. Yes, that can be, I think, somewhat useful maybe if you're doing large training sessions or maybe very intense training sessions. But I just think that, one way that I've been using it now, and I found kind of some value in this, is measuring pre, intra, and several post HRV measures, and seeing the different responses to different modalities and also different intensities. And I found that to actually be quite useful so far.
And how do you use that? How does it then benefit the next or the planning that you do?
So I haven't used this with other athletes yet, but what I'm seeing is my responses to certain types of intensities are different than what I thought. And I think what I'm going to see is that there's going to be some different responses depending on the type of intensities that you're hitting between individuals. And that's something I think we've always kind of knew. And I think Phil Bellinger's done a good job at putting some of his research forth and saying, hey, depending on some of even just muscle fiber typology, you're going to see some different response times. You're going to see some different onsets of overreaching, right? But also, I think there's a whole nother level to that, which I don't think we'll be able to even understand for years, is neurological response to different types of training. I think just inherently, we don't have very good tools to measure that, obviously, and we won't for a very long time. And I don't think that'll ever be in the future. But I think there's other factors that are in play with response to exercise. Yeah, I like that answer. And everything is very well explained so far. So
yeah. Can I say one thing on the HRV? One more thing that is just a bit of an issue that I have with the studies that have been done in HRV guided training. So the idea of a go/no-go decision based on, or reduce intensity decision based on your HRV score in the morning, or your HRV baseline, depending on how the study is set up. But the issue that I have is that you can't blind the participants to what they're doing. They or at least from my memory, that's not what has been done. Maybe it has been done in some of the studies. I haven't read them all, but I think it's hard to do. And in many of the studies anyway, they haven't done that. So then the HRV guided group, they know that they are training according to that, they are changing their training based on the HRV scores, and that could inherently induce a placebo effect, which is why there has seemed to be a small positive effect of HRV guided training over non-HRV guided training. So I'm not saying that it's all placebo. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I think it's a methodological issue with the studies, and it's something that you see when athletes are very religiously measure HRV. That then if they have a low score one day, which might just be a measurement error, then it kind of it puts them off training, even trying to do what was prescribed when they could maybe potentially have had a perfectly fine workout. So that's something that I've been thinking about, and why I'm less into it than I used to.
No, I 110% agree with you. And I discourage certain types of individuals to not use HRV, especially like that type 3 under the Braverman, where they're very kind of, the GABA deficient essentially. But anyways, not going to go into that, but they're very meticulous about their data. And I think that some of these scores, and I do believe HRV has a placebo effect, even just the attention surrounding your recovery and just the novelty of such a measure is kind of exciting for people. And I do think that I definitely think there's a placebo effect with that. But also I do think some people have in the past, like that I've seen, have responded poorly to HRV because they can't separate themselves from the measure. No matter how much you tell them that, hey, the error of your measurement, also this is probably what you're going to see after a poor night's sleep or whatever, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to perform any better or lose adaptation. If we're seeing it in several, anyways, I 100% agree with you. I think that's a very honest statement as well. And you're right. They haven't been able to blind, so it's true. One thing I'm interested to hear is what are some things that you're currently excited about surrounding whether it's testing, training, or coaching? Because one statement that I've heard you say in a podcast before, which I found really useful and I've implemented it into my own practice, is take more time and more effort into making a decision on something that you're using. Whether it's, a new training style, or whether it's a new kind of intervention that you're playing around with, or a certain type of test, take the time, even if it's going poorly for a bit, just take a little bit more time to make your decision. Don't jump onto the next thing. I think everyone, especially now with the amount of information that they're taking in, it's very hard to separate themselves from seeing what someone else is doing and not wanting to try what someone else is doing. But we all have our weaknesses, and trying to utilize something and give something the best possible chance. So what are some of the things that you're currently playing around with or excited to try and understand more about? Doesn't have to be a technology. It could be a modality. It could be a concept.
Yeah. So the thing that I'm the most excited about right now is swim training, in particular in a triathlon context. So basically, the concept of, and this is actually not somebody that although I'm by no means the first one to have done this or come up with this, but it's not something that any particular person or anything like that has inspired me to do. It's something that has kind of grown organically in me, so to say, and now I'm testing it out with myself especially, but also with some of my athletes, and it is about training swimming more like you would the run and the bike component, because we have a very strong influence from traditional swim training in triathlon swimming as well, meaning you do sets with lots of what I would call bells and whistles, and maybe in a not so positive connotation here. Basically, a lot of stuff is there's a lot of things going on, quite a lot in many swim sets. Lots of different drills. You don't always necessarily know why you're doing the drills. Lots of different, tons of different intervals of different speeds, and you just mix and match, and you get something that takes a whole whiteboard to write down, and nobody can be expected to remember it if they go to the pools. So what I'm really thinking is the case with swimming, and this is, I should caveat this by saying that swimming is an extremely technical sport, and developing your swim technique is always going to be top priority for athletes if they want to swim well. But at the same time, I think there are a lot of athletes that have a decent technique, not a world-class technique, but they are not necessarily held back by their technique. There's only so much that improved technique can do for them right now, or at least the improved technique that they can realistically hope to achieve with their time available for training, and not just swim training, but dry land mobility and so on, and their anatomy and their current mobility and so on. So I think a lot of athletes are that have a decent technique are held back not by technique but by training methods, and that's where, because I think that as triathletes, triathlon coaches, we do have a very strong influence of copying what pool swimmers are doing and just trying to do that ourselves. But we have a lot less time to swim. We're a lot not as good as they are by far, and so on. So when I say training swimming more like you train the bike and the run, a few of the things that are included in that is, first of all, doing more just long, easy endurance swimming. That's important, and because often you see athletes doing an quote-unquote endurance swim, but they do 30 times 100, and maybe in half of those 100s they have a build because it makes it more fun and engaging. So a build like an acceleration in the second 50 meters, something like that. So actually you swim for a minute 20, and then you break for 10-15 seconds, and you swim for a minute 20 or a minute 30 or a minute 40 or whatever it is again, and you take a short break and then you keep swimming. But you wouldn't do a bike workout like that or a run workout like that if the goal is just the aerobic endurance component. So I'm experimenting with things like 10 times 400, 8 times 600, 5 times 800, those sorts of sets. Very boring, but it is an endurance sport. Endurance sport is a bit monotonous, and you have to learn to enjoy the monotony, I think. And so that's one aspect of it. A second aspect is I think we're often doing the intense swimming at way too high intensities. So I've actually started doing a little bit of lactate testing in the pool, and this is still early days, so I'm not necessarily using that for to prescribe intensities, but you can do it even without lactate testing. That's just a curiosity for me, really. But for example, a typical swim set might be 15 times 100 at quote unquote threshold with 15 seconds break. So in duration terms, that would again be something like 15 times 1 minute 20, or maybe you do 20 times 1 minute 20, or 1 minute 40, or 1 minute 50, depending on how fast you are. And then you rest, quite often very short rests. Let's say 15 seconds would be quite common for 15 times 100. And if you swim in, let's say, a minute 30, that means that your work to rest ratio is something like it's 6-1, if I do my math right, which is quite very high compared to what you would typically do for a threshold workout on the bike and the run, where it might be more like 2-1 would be quite common, or 3-1 or something like that. So I'm trying to do sets that are, first of all, longer intervals, so that you don't swim them way too hard, because that's the other thing that happens. You basically do that as 15 times 100 as hard as you can, and this happens especially if you swim with a group. And I do think that there's a lot of value in group swimming in the right amount and in the right group and for the right athlete, but there are also a lot of caveats and a lot of potential disadvantages that you need to navigate. So we end up swimming that 15 times 100 basically as an all-out set, so it becomes more like a VO2 max workout almost, but with very short recoveries. And then a lot of athletes find themselves really tired for the entire rest of the day, and no wonder, because you just did an extremely hard workout with a lot of anaerobic energy contribution, and it was basically a time trial. And so the way I would rewrite that threshold workout would be to do more total work, do longer intervals, so that it's more difficult for the athlete to go too hard, but also having the pace prescription be correct from the start. So that would be, let's say, we could prescribe the workout as 12 times 200. So we're increasing from 1,500 meters to 2,400 meters of total work. We're also increasing the rests, so that to, let's say, 45 seconds or something, so to make it a bit more appropriate, or even 1 minute. It's still short compared to the work to rest ratio of cycling and running. And probably that's just because I still have that bias of knowing what typical swim workouts still look like. So I don't have the courage to go extreme on, what is perceived as extreme on the rests. But in terms of pacing there, I would say that, your threshold is something that you could hold for, let's say, 30 minutes in a time trial. So actually I've had at least one athlete so far do a 1,900 meter time trial, which is a good distance to do a time trial for, because it's also the 7.3 swim distance. So if you're training for that distance, then it's a good one. But it also, for a lot of athletes, it takes in the region of 25 to 30 minutes if they're a relatively quick swimmer. And so you get that, you can use that as basically your threshold if you want to, and then prescribe training accordingly. So this is something that I'm really excited about, as you can probably tell, because I talked about that for a long time.
I really enjoyed hearing that, because I was just speaking with Jason Koop actually yesterday. And one of the things I really enjoyed about his book was, some of the philosophies and theories around training and structuring training never really made sense to me. But when people start pulling them apart and testing them and saying, hey, if physiology works this way for this thing, why would it work different for this other thing that we're doing that we're trying to gain the same adaptations for? So I think it's really cool that you're playing around with that. And I think especially with swimming, I'm sure you're aware that the culture is very, very ingrained with the training is a very sacredly held kind of totem there. So it's, whenever you start veering off the path, it definitely feels like there's something inherently wrong with what you're doing. But from what you said and the reasons why you're doing it, it makes sense, right? So I think stuff like that as a coach is where coaches really hold a lot of value after some years of getting confidence to be able to say, hey, I'm going to pull this string because I can't see any physiological reason why this wouldn't make sense. Let's just test it out and see how it does. Because I think inherently you're going to get athletes that are just going to respond better to pretty much any type of variation, right? Because not every athlete is going to respond the same to the given stimulus that is kind of proposed as the workout. So slightly changing those in one direction, you're probably just going to see some better responses from people, I would guess. But also when it kind of runs in line with what the physiology is saying, I would guess that that would also add another layer where it's like, we're probably going to see a good response from that. But it's interesting. I think that's a really smart tweak to play around with. So yeah.
One thing that I want to add for the listeners' benefit, if they're curious about this, is with the longer endurance reps that I talked about, the let's say 4 or 5 times 800 or 5 times 600 or whatever. The reason that I do that is not just because they're long, so they're more endurance-like than stopping every 100 meters, but it's to force the athlete to swim slower. Because if you have that workout, I know that, okay, I need to, and you also, in those intervals, the rest is basically just a mental rest. It's 20 to 30 seconds because in a ride you wouldn't stop unless you had to, or in a run you wouldn't stop unless you had to. So it's basically the same concept there in swimming. So the reason to prescribe those long duration intervals is that, well, then it forces you to swim at the right low intensity, because that's what I feel is another issue with the endurance swims that we quite often see, that people just swim those way too hard. So all the swimming ends up being very hard. And I think that it works really well for some people, because basically they are the creme de la creme of the best swimmers and also the most tolerant to training load. And then it works really well. But for a lot of people, it just is too much, and they don't adapt, or worse, they start to maladapt. So that was the rationale behind those longer endurance intervals.
I like that. And it's funny because, in certain cultures, there is a lot of physiology tied to certain things, whether it's lactate testing, like you were talking about experimenting with just recently. Like we know in Germany, that's where a lot of the lactate research, whether it's Albrecht or Mater. But when I think about swimming in North America, there's a lot less of that, okay, where is your actual threshold here? Where is your second threshold? Where is your first threshold? How much do these things matter when we're trying to organize training? I hear much less of that around swimming. Swimming is kind of similar to track, where it's like paces. We got to hit our paces.
Yeah. But there's also, to defend the swimming coaches, there's less reason to care about those things in swimming, where most events are so short. So, okay, the 1500 is a long event, but all the other events last just a few minutes or less than a minute. So then what your first threshold is definitely doesn't really matter, unless again it's the 1500 or something. Then maybe that matters a little bit, but probably not that much. But in marathon swimming, obviously it does start. It does matter, but there is a reason that it's not really as. I think that's a reason that you don't really need to care about it as much as a swimming coach. But as triathletes, we swim for much longer, and we need to bike and run after that. So we should be aware of these things and take them into account.
Yeah, that brings up something in my head, whereas like inherently with triathlon training, the first threshold for modalities, I think, does take a larger precedence than in most sports, because generally with triathlon, the training volume is inherently going to be much higher. So the importance of intensity starts to amplify as training volume increases. That threshold and how much training you're doing around that threshold or above that threshold, first and second threshold, does start to take a larger impact, I think. But you're inherently right with as a swimming coach, it's the same as like kind of like an 800 meter runner, 1500 meter runner. The specific threshold doesn't matter as much, obviously, because there's a lot of things going on in the training outside of just building aerobic capacity that is important, and the training volume is so low that there's more room there for variance around those lower paces. One thing that I'm interested to hear, because you have so many interesting individuals on your podcast investigating interesting topics surrounding exercise physiology. What are some areas of exercise physiology that you're interested currently in or trying to understand better? It could be anything from cardiac response or cardiovascular system. It could be respiratory. It could be, maybe it's nothing really to do in that. Maybe it's something surrounding durability. It doesn't have to be something physiological, or it could be more training orientated or anything.
Yeah. Well, right now, it's really the fundamentals of how the human body works in an exercise context. So I'm going through the book of George Brooks, Exercise Physiology. So basically, I'm just reading it from cover to cover. So I want to just get a reminder of some of these things that and obviously learn a lot of new things along the way as well. But basically, improving my knowledge of the fundamentals. So there are a lot of cell biology going on at the moment, and well, not cell biology necessarily, but how the cell works during exercise and going through the energy systems and all of that. So it's a very right now my interest is the fundamentals. He will go into things like the cardiovascular system and all of that. So I'm interested in all of that, but learn the fundamentals, because I think that will help me then better understand some of the research that I'm reading that is more complex, shall we say, or maybe just more complex because I don't have that particular knowledge. So I think it will help obviously it will help with understanding training in general, but in particular it's for understanding certain research that I might not fully grasp otherwise.
It's funny that you mentioned that. That's literally one of my favorite textbooks that is on my shelf. Andre Feldman actually recommended it to me. But starting out, there's a lot of density, like in the beginning talking about, I don't know which edition you have, but free energy and Gibbs free energy model and exergonic and all these different, I like it. Like in terms of a textbook, if I was going to recommend, I'm sure you'd probably recommend it to folks as well. It's a very complete textbook. Like the one I have, the new one has 2 volumes. And they're loaded with, every page is loaded with efficient information.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I'm not completely through it yet, or actually I have a long way to go still. But I do think it's great. Yeah, absolutely great. I can say that already.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, and it's funny because I think one thing that I've noticed through coaches that have built up some good experiences, a lot of the times there's kind of a cycle of coming back to the basics and understanding the basics at a deeper level. I've seen, it's not with every coach, but I definitely do take into account that I've picked that out with a few people talking about going back to the basics. Some very well experienced coaches out there. And I think it kind of serves at the right time, because I feel like yes, it's great to have an understanding of physiology in the beginning, but I think it can really confuse a lot of, young coaches, and definitely take away from building coaching experience, good coaching experience and good decision-making. Like, yes, it is inherently going to enhance the ability to understand, this is why we're doing this amount of aerobic training versus, some of these higher thresholds work versus VO2 max. Like, it's good to understand that, but the actual cell physiology, I believe it kind of comes back at the right time for a lot of people, where it's like, okay, yes, now it's really going to be even more useful having the experiences that I've already had. Yeah. So you're
completely agree.
Yeah, you're not in survival mode trying to understand the, lactate shuttle transporters. And anyways, so one interesting question that I've never really asked anyone before, but I'd be really interested to hear your take on this, because Coming from where you're coming from, if you were to coach yourself as a 16-year-old athlete, knowing what you know about yourself and knowing your kind of tendencies, knowing your strengths, your weaknesses, how would you intervene as a coach to create the best possible version of yourself at the age of 30 in the sport of triathlon? Like, what are some of the things that you would have pulled the trigger on maybe a little bit earlier, a little bit later, maybe approached yourself and trying to instill some philosophy behind certain training models and certain training concepts? What are some of the things that you would do to try and get the best out of yourself by 30?
Yeah, this is very interesting. In particular, because I read the question wrong, so I didn't read the about myself part. So I just took a generic example, but that's fine. I will answer it as you asked the question. Yeah, I think definitely the first thing I would do, and this is something that I did write down for a generic example as well, is just instilling the importance of and educating myself about the importance of enjoying the process and about consistency and how that means that I have to have as a main objective to stay healthy and stay injury free. So and then taking the steps to make sure that I do that, and I mean that would definitely mean less running than I did in my late teens and especially early 20s, where I just built up because I was enjoying the running, but then inevitably I got injured. Mm-hmm. So yeah, if I started as a 16-year-old in triathlon, I mean, I still think that at a certain point you have to have like a really good amount of talent to get to that level. But let's pretend that I have that talent. I would focus a lot on skills in those early years, and also speed and power, but not necessarily in terms of a lot of super like hard anaerobic workouts, but doing it as part of and ideally I would do this somewhere where I have a training group that I can train with. So doing things like training races and doing a lot of short races like super sprint races. I think those are brilliant, sprint distance races and so on. So yeah, focusing on skills and some speed and power, and skills in terms of the technique of the different sports, but also in terms of racing skills, racing a lot, but racing short races, really short races. And then gradually keep track of volume very carefully and build it very gradually. And also, I mean, I would definitely think that you can always, as a 16-year-old for sure, you can definitely do things like, threshold workouts and VO2 max workouts. But when I'm saying that I would focus on skills and speed and power, that's more like, okay, that would be a bigger emphasis in those early years. And then gradually, as I would get older, I would transition more towards emphasizing the threshold work, especially more if you have been training from 16 to, let's say, the last year of racing as an under 23, then at that point you have probably already built up a VO2 max that might be quite close to what it's going to reach for you if the training has been going well. So at that point, especially, is when I would maybe think about transitioning to doing, really focusing on doing threshold work, quite a lot of that, probably at least in relative terms to what I've been doing before, and maybe decreasing some of that other work, and the volume would be coming up all the time to a certain level, of course. Like maybe when you reach 23, 24, 25, you're at your peak volume, but probably not before that. And in that way, that would contribute to the aerobic capacity going up, but also the economy. So that's things like the threshold and the economy are the kind of things that help you keep improving beyond 23, well into your late 20s and early 30s, I think. So yeah, I think that as an overview, that's kind of how I would go about it. But definitely can't emphasize enough the importance of focusing on staying healthy and injury free as something to do with. So having a good physiotherapist and all of that.
I really like that, especially speaking on the short races, which is inherently genius. When I even think of track coaches having their athletes compete maybe a little bit more often than some would say is, hey, that's not very, but those short, like the enjoyment of competing is where it's at, right? That's people don't do the sport just for the training. They do it because they enjoy competing. And if you can inherently intertwine training the physiology well, like obviously every race is training the physiology to some degree, but with especially with those shorter sprints, there's much less of a especially with triathlon, because when you get out to these further distances, that takes much longer time to recover from, and disrupts the training process quite dramatically. So I really like that answer, and it definitely like kind of ticks a lot of the boxes for building some type of structure for enjoyment, because I think that's where a lot of athletes fall off, is the enjoyment starts to decrease a little bit too much because of the training goals are inherently held too high.
And I think, I mean, that's an interesting thing that you mentioned, and I mentioned it before with the culture question that you asked. When I was 16, I was living in Finland. There wouldn't have been really any sort of training group that I could join to do the type of, organic workouts where you just go out and ride your bike, learn to ride in a group, learn to corner well because you follow the fastest person and they know how to corner well, and those sort of things. You have to sprint up the short punchy hills and so on, so you develop some speed and power there. There just isn't that type of environment for young triathletes there to develop. Here, on the other hand, in Portugal, there is that environment. There's lots of training groups for young athletes. So I think that I know it's a hypothetical question, but I think it's definitely a question where if somebody is thinking about that for themselves, then I think that group is really important, not because it's always the optimal training, but for the enjoyment, but also just immersion is an important aspect of learning a lot of different skills. So I think sometimes you have to be a bit careful with the group training, because sometimes it's set to the fastest person in the group or something like that, and it's not always individualized, but it doesn't always have to be super individualized, especially not at that age. You're basically building up to be able to train really well once you're 23, 24, 25. So I think that group environment is another important aspect of it if you're looking at long-term athlete development from a kind of youth and junior, from the youth and junior years into your senior years.
Yeah, that's funny because it brought up things in my head, some thoughts and memories of, you have this transition when you exit, for most individuals, unless you're a professional, you have this transition where you are spending a lot of time around your teammates, whether that's in sport teams at school or you're hanging out with them after school, and you have this environment that you don't really realize the value of, right? It's just kind of ingrained with your everyday life. And then you get older and then it's like, oh, it's a group ride. And then it turns into a group ride less often. And then it's like, long stretches of time training alone. And you forget, especially with endurance sport, you forget a lot of the times how much that team environment drives intrinsic motivation and drives the ability to go out and suffer and enjoy suffering. And we know that from, hot spots, different places of the world where athletes excel at certain sports, because inherently everything is tied into that sport. The culture is tied into that sport. So it's much easier to suffer for something that you're tied to on a characteristic level, right? That's interesting. Moving off of that, I'd like to ask you essentially, how do you start shrinking the black box? Like you talked about, experimenting with some lactate with swimming, but I know you mentioned earlier about critical power with your athletes. How do you go about shrinking that black box and understanding what am I going to use for intervention with the athlete? What do I think this is what the athlete needs? How do you go about that? Do you test often with certain athletes? Do you kind of have a regular schedule where you do testing with athletes? What is it that you use? Maybe it's not as much testing. Maybe it's just monitoring their efforts and training a little bit more and testing more sporadically. What is it that you use
Yeah, well, it depends,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it always comes down to what are the athlete's goals, and then okay, comparing where they are currently with
Mm-hmm.
where they want to go, so where their goals are, and doing a gap analysis, and then we can figure out that okay, so if you have just a 1 minute deficit on the swim, but you have a 15-minute deficit on the bike and a 30-minute deficit on the run in your gap analysis, so comparing your goals to where you currently are. So where you currently are in this context means, okay, what did you do in your last race?
Mm-hmm.
Well, because we're looking at the racing goal here. Then in that context, I would say, okay, well, let's just keep the swimming as it is for now. We don't need to prioritize that very much because you have bigger fishes to fry, and that's the bike and the run, and they are probably very connected. If you have a 30-minute improvement again on the run, they don't have to be necessarily, but in Ironman especially, they often are. So if you get fitter on the bike, then it's easier to run closer to your potential off the bike as well. So then you start thinking about, okay, well, first of all, how much power do you need to bike 15 minutes faster, or can you gain that time somehow through aerodynamical improvements, and you start to consider your options, and maybe it's a combination of the two. And then on the run, you also think about, well, okay, can we maybe improve your bike? Do you have more room to grow on the bike? So we improve your bike so much that you can bike at a lower percentage of what you could actually be doing of your threshold or your VO2 max, and then hitting the run goal will be easier, even if you don't necessarily improve your run fitness, because you'll just get there with more left in the tank. You might also look at nutrition, hydration, and all of these things. So really, it's a long checklist of things that you have to go through of what are the things that you really, really need to work on. And then you start to prioritize, and obviously you can't work on everything, but you have to kind of choose 2, 3, 4 things maybe that you work on. And then in many cases, you don't necessarily need any specific testing because there is enough data. There is the power duration curve and just information from races that the athlete has done that you might not need specific. For example, if I want to prescribe a threshold workout, I know close enough where it is that I don't necessarily need to do a test to find out exactly where it is, because I don't think it's that important. But in some cases, it is useful, and then you do whatever testing you need to. You might, for example, sometimes not be quite sure. Okay, so sometimes you might need to know at what percentage of VO2 max are you actually operating? Like, is there even room to improve your threshold, or do we need to improve your VO2 max? And in that case, yeah, you need to go and measure your VO2 max. So it always depends, but for me, it always comes down to doing a gap analysis. Where does the athlete want to go? Where are they now? And then you figure out what are the main priorities to work on, and then how do we work on them? So that's kind of the operation order for the process. And I think that's as an overview, that's what I do.
Yeah. I like that. Yeah, because it every coach has their process, and depending on who the coach is, whether they're like a university coach, it's just kind of a lot of times, okay, we're training all as a group, right? Because that's kind of the resources that are available. And then you'll see some that kind of do specific, like whether it's anaerobic speed reserve, kind of splitting the athletes up into different groups, trying to understand some basic kind of physiological preferences maybe. But yeah, I like hearing everyone's process, because a lot of them are similar, but there's specific things about them that are unique and maybe more useful for certain coaches, because you see on the other side where people get very heavy on the testing, analyzing testing, and yes, critical power, some of these things are easy to measure, but you also have to take into account, like, how are you going to use these things in the training, which carrying over testing data isn't always as clean as everyone thinks it is, because not every test goes as planned. So testing can be disruptive, especially with athletes that aren't used to it. And they're not used to, certain things surrounding testing. And it's nice when, you have the ability and the experience and things like this to just kind of look at an athlete, and understand like, okay, this is where they're sitting at roughly for this. This is where they're sitting at for this. Okay, I've got a good idea here. It's much more efficient, and it can be even more effective, I think, because you're focusing on the things that you need to be focusing on. Anyways, that was kind of a long way of saying I like it. But so one of the things that I want to ask is if you could have any piece of technology, because how I kind of usually frame this question, because I've asked it before, is most athletes use heart rate, right? This is kind of something that's been well adopted in the community. Some heart rate monitors are just less accurate and less useful, but regardless of that, it's kind of been around for a while now. It's kind of here to stay. If you could have another piece of technology, whether it's from the field of exercise physiology, maybe it's from medical diagnostics, it could be anything. It could be a functional MRI. I don't know, like people have crazy answers. Maybe it's software. Maybe it's a specific type of software that can, using AI, could detect certain things in the athlete. What would that technology be? Why would you choose that piece of technology? Like, for example, having a VO2 master, right? Every athlete could have a VO2 master, something that is like $30,000. And obviously the VO2 master is not the quality data that you're getting from a Parvo or some of these other gold standards. But what is something that you would use along with heart rate that you would incorporate?
Okay, so to clarify the question, I only have heart rate. I don't have power or pace, or do I have these?
No, you have everything that you have. So you have everything that you would normally use with athletes, but you could add another piece to that.
Right. And another clarification question, does this thing have to exist or can I dream up something?
It stays within the realm of technology. So what I tell people is you could use something like MRS or something like that's in the field already. But you can compact it and commercialize it essentially.
Right. Yeah. Well, because I had it might be possible in the future. I did write that continuous non-invasive lactate measurement would be quite interesting to have. But for something that exists now, actually, if all of my athletes had a lactate meter and a capacity to test themselves, then that wouldn't be too shabby. So I might go with that. But I did actually, as a dark horse, I did note down, as you say, MRS for identifying muscle fiber typology. I do think that's really cool technology. And I used to work in MRI actually in R&D, so I'm quite interested in the field. But actually, I think that just the profiling capacity that this new technology, so finding out whether an athlete is more slow twitch or like their muscle fiber composition between fast twitch and slow twitch fibers, could actually have a decent impact on training decisions and therefore training response as well. So I think, it's not the one that I would choose first, but it's a very cool piece of technology that I just had to mention.
Yeah, no, I'm on the same page. That is my kind of pick. It is being used, I've heard, with several different professional sporting teams now to some degree. But it is. I think that would yield a ton of useful information surrounding response and for training intervention. But on the topic of continuous lactate monitors, there's actually, because I've asked this question before, there's a couple people that have mentioned that. And I was talking to Mike T. Nelson, and he made me aware that Abbott, so that makes the freestyle blood glucose monitor, they're coming out with a continuous lactate monitor in the near future. And I think it also is going to detect continuous ketone, blood glucose, and alcohol and lactate. So all four of those. And I think he said they're fairly close. I can't remember. I didn't look exactly on the timeline for release. I think it was in the near future, they said, whatever that means. But I'll be interested, especially when it becomes like applicable for athletes, because CGMs, like a lot of them aren't really meant for the abuse that athletes are putting them under. So.
No, yeah, especially swimming is a hard one. I found I've tried them, and yeah, it was difficult.
Yeah. So getting into some of the final questions here that I'm interested to hear from your perspective is, what is a preconceived notion that led to kind of a large failure in your whether it could be coaching, it could be just in learning, whether it was school, your education, but probably be interesting to hear more towards coaching is, what is a preconceived notion or an incorrect hypothesis that you've learned a great deal from in that failure, and what was kind of the thinking and the bias that led to that, and how did you realize you were off course? How did you realize that you were not where you should be?
Yeah, in my early coaching days, I think that helping athletes with goal paces for their races is something that sometimes just did not go well. So, for example, the pace was way too hard, right? Or sometimes, less often, it was not quite hard enough, but more often it was a pace that the athlete couldn't actually sustain for the race. And I mean, there are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, thinking about, okay, so what percentage of threshold can I hold for a race, and what do other people say that you should be able to hold for a race of a certain distance, like an Olympic distance race, and what have I seen other my athletes do, but they might be at the same fitness level, or they might be at the same fitness level but just have more endurance, which this current athlete does not have. So I would say that that's one thing that I've found that I sometimes definitely failed with, giving incorrect pacing advice to athletes that then backfired on them. And nowadays I have a different approach to pacing, basically kind of race simulation workouts to figure out what the pace is. So that's a big one that came to mind.
That was a good one, and I think it's probably one that many of coaches have ran into or are struggling with, because pacing is and
a lot of self-coached athletes, I think, as well could learn from this, because when you a lot of athletes, and I know because I've done this, you Google, okay, what percentage of FTP should I hold for an Olympic distance race or a 703, and then you see, and the numbers that you see in the first search results on Google, I would say for a lot of athletes, they are good for pretty advanced athletes, pretty strong athletes that also have trained adequately for the distance and have a really good base of fitness. But many athletes don't fulfill all of those criteria, so should have more conservative pacing targets than the ones you find in the first results on Google.
Yeah. Especially when you're dealing with like age groupers, because the variance is so large. It can be very difficult to take broad spectrum ideas around pacing. Another thing that I think you kind of alluded to it because you talked about using critical power. What is the one kind of test that you would, if you solely could only use one test? You did speak on race simulation, like within workouts or time trials, too, as well. But if you can only use one type of test with your athletes for the next 3 to 5 years, what would that be? Would that be critical power? Would that be just kind of time trialing? I mean, they are kind of mixed in the same thing, but maybe it would be a lactate test. Maybe it would be a ramp test, whatever it is. It could be even a diagnostics test, like I said, lactate or NIRS or something. I don't know, whatever it is that you think is useful, and why would you choose that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess it depends a little bit on the athlete. But I would say probably, just a time trial, or, being able to use time trials, and then through that, you can build a power duration curve and critical power and so on. That would be the main one. On the other hand, if I were to be a bit cheeky, then I would say that, well, I can prescribe any workouts I like, right? So I can prescribe just all out efforts in workouts. So then I can get my power duration curve without calling it a test, and get critical power through that as well. So then I can maybe add a second test, and in that case, if I were allowed to do that, it would probably be a lactate test just for identifying LT1. So I don't care for LT2 particularly, or and MLSS testing is just too complex, too time consuming. So it's for lactate for me is mostly useful for finding LT1 is the main lactate testing objective that I see. But and I mean, a lot of my athletes don't use it because it's just not necessary. If you have a good sense of your own pacing, then and you are relatively well trained, then it's easy enough to do the easy training easy enough, which is one of the main reasons I think to do lactate testing. But there's definitely in some cases when you want to actually train closer to that point, there are some scenarios where I do find it very useful to know it more exactly. So yeah, maybe I would say that, well, I could just do the time trials as part of the athlete's normal training, so it's not formal testing, and then I would add a lactate test for finding LT1 as the diagnostics tool, if that makes sense.
No, I like that answer, and I think that's just a fairly useful system. Like even, like I said, if you could only use one, I mean that in itself, I think, I was speaking to Phil Skiba on this, is like, it's such a useful model because, like you said, you can incorporate it into athletes' workouts, and athletes do like seeing their 5-minute power. They like seeing these things. So it's not as much of the pulling teeth process of, the classical 20-minute FTP test. And even though they're different, but, or some of these ramp tests, but yeah, you're right. It is, I find those models useful because not only are they just testing, they're also they're training as well. Like people forget that testing and training aren't really that separated as much as people like to think. Like, oh, it disrupts training, but that's still physiological adaptation that you're gaining. So, all right. So last question here is, what are some areas of interest outside of exercise physiology, sport performance, coaching, triathlon? Maybe it's a passion, maybe it's an expertise or something that you spend a lot of time delving into. What is an area outside that you spend a lot of effort or time or passionate about?
Well, so this is 5 years ago, but so I'm no longer an expert, but I was really involved in medical devices. So both MRI, as I mentioned, but also transcranial direct current stimulation, which is interesting because there's not a lot, but there is some sports science with the potential effects of TDCS on performance. And if you have read Alex Hutchinson's Endure, which a lot of people have, then they talk a lot about TDCS there. But yeah, we never use it for sports performance, or I did in the lab, but for myself. But yeah, our purpose was medical devices. So I used to be into that field and know a fair amount in there. But I enjoyed it, even though I wouldn't say I was super passionate about it like I am endurance sports. But yeah, I guess right now, like, I don't have any other areas of expertise, but I do have other interests. Like I still follow English football, Premier League, but yeah, that's just, it's not something I do very very purposefully or anything. It's just a pastime. And then I guess one other thing is that I really like audiobooks, and right now I'm interested in learning more about how the world works. So I've been reading some audiobooks in the kind of geopolitics realm recently, and that's something I'm really enjoying. Again, definitely not an expert, but just something that I'm enjoying doing.
Yeah, those are all interesting. And it's funny you're talking about the medical devices. I haven't ever really stated this out loud to many people, but it'll be cool. I was one of those kids that was constructing my own TDCS device out of 9-volt batteries. Oh, wow. When I was younger, because I thought I was going to get, I mean, inherently, yes, there's a placebo effect with it, but yeah, I obviously do not recommend this practice for anyone out there. But it was a cool experimentation process, and it was also really cool because it stimulated a lot of learning off of that. And yeah, that's funny that you're into that. But yeah, no, those were good answers. I think yeah, the geopolitics and all those things. It's a very nice intellectual endeavor, because to grasp everything in that field, you don't feel the same pressure to accumulate the knowledge as you would in some other fields where it's kind of easier to consume more of the information out there, so you kind of feel pressure. For me anyways, I don't know, this is how I feel. Like you said, it's hard to be an expert in geopolitics because it really depends on what type of areas you're really kind of intimate with and stuff like that. So yeah, those were all great. So folks can find your podcast on pretty much anywhere that you get podcasts, that Triathlon Show. Also, I'll link your website and your social media in the show notes, so folks can find you there. But yeah, really appreciate you taking the time today, Michael.
Fantastic. Yeah, I enjoyed it. It was a great chat. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks. We'll catch you later, folks.
I hope that you enjoyed that episode. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com, where I'll have links to Matthew's website and Instagram, as well as to the Oxidative Potential podcast, which is co-hosted by Matthew and Phil Batterson, who is the other host of the podcast. I will also try to remember which resources, podcast episodes, and so on we might have mentioned in this interview. Usually when I interview someone, I try to take notes whenever something is mentioned that should be put in the show notes later. So I have just a paper with notes about that, but I didn't think to do it this time around when I was being interviewed. But I do have a couple of relevant links that I'll put in there. And if there's something we mentioned that you can't find, feel free to email me and I'll see if I can find it for you. If you want to improve your triathlon performance and want help to achieve your goals, then consider working with a scientific triathlon coach or training plan. Whether you're just getting into triathlon, trying to qualify for a world championship event, or even want to race professionally, we have experience in all of those scenarios and would love to discuss further around if and how we can help you on your triathlon journey. Find out more and contact us on scientifictriathlon.com, and we can discuss your specific goals and needs and see what's best for you. And finally, big thanks to our sponsors, Roka, that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and exceptional sunglasses and prescription glasses for everything from day-to-day wear to extreme action sports. Use the promo code that you can get on roka.com/TTS to get 20% off your entire Roka order. And thank you to Zen8. Use the Zen8 swim trainer to improve your technique, power, stamina, and your swim training consistency. Get 20% off your order on the swim trainer with the promo code that you can get on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. And don't forget that it's a risk-free investment. If you don't love it after 2 weeks, send it back and you'll get a full refund. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.